Hi everyone. Let's start our discussion with chapter 11, and in this chapter 11 we will be discussing this prospective financial information and other assurance services. If we go back and look at the standards that are covered in this chapter, there are three standards that are covered and all of them are SAEs. So, one is SAE 3400, second one is SAE 3402 and the third one is SAE 3420. Now, we have already covered SAE 3400. So, now our discussion would be on to this SAE 3402, which deals with assurance reports on controls at a service organization. Now, so let's begin our discussion with SAE 3402. Now, for this, I will have to take you to our class materials. Now, let us come here. Now, before I start our discussion, the ones that we are discussing are SAEs and not the SAs, standards in auditing. So, what is the difference between SA and SAE? We have already discussed this at length in our earlier video, but I would like to touch one more time. So, the SA, which stands for standards in auditing, they deal with historical financial information. So, the SAs basically deal with audits of this historical financial statements, whereas SAEs, they do not deal with the audit. That is what you can see it here. Other than, so they deal with any engagement other than audit or review of historical financial statements. So, what is being stressed and what is being reviewed on SAs is historical. This word is the keyword. And audits. But here, no audit, no review, and no historical. So, that is the difference between them. Now, let us start our discussion. After understanding what is the difference between SA and SAE, now let us start our discussion with the SAE 3402, which deals with this service organization. So, in this standard, we basically talk about the controls and controls where, say, we are talking of controls at service organization. So, to understand and to enter into this standard, you need to have a clarity of two words. One is service organization and the other one is the user entity. These are the words which will keep banging throughout the standard. So, let us understand this. But before I take you through formally this concept, I will explain through a practical example. I will give the background. I will try to give you the background why this standard had become relevance of it. See, of late, after this MNCs coming into picture, the bigger companies, like say including the G Capital or Microsoft, so any of these companies, all these companies, they prefer outsourcing certain data to a third parties. Now, which processes they are outsourcing? They are outsourcing their key processes like payroll and or accounting. So, these are the core activities, but nowadays these companies prefer to outsource this data. Now, I will just take you through some of the practical examples of how these have been outsourced, and we will look at the practical example of companies which are outsourcing of what function. And then through that example, if we try to understand what is user entity and what is service organization, it would become conceptually, it will become more clear to you. So, let us look at the practical example. Now, let us look at this chart. Now, in this chart, we are trying to display what are all the major organizations which are handling the outsourcing activities. Like ADP, ADP is known for providing payroll processing, and this ADP provides payroll for many other companies. Say, I mean, all the bigger companies, whichever you take on manufacturing or IT companies, they prefer to outsource their payroll function to ADP. Their expertise lies in processing of ADP. Similarly, TCS and Infosys, you know that they are the biggest organizations which provide any kind of technical support. And then Accenture. So, Accenture will take care of the finance and accounting outsourcing of major companies, and even the larger operations they would prefer to outsource. And there is Genpact, which will handle accounting, finance, payroll and procurement of another multinational companies. Now, let us take an example of first two. So, imagine one IT company, let's say XYZ Limited, XYZ Limited. Now, this company, they are not processing the payroll within their organization themselves, rather they had outsourced it to ADP. So, how does it work? Who are the employees this XYZ Limited is recruiting, and whatever, who are the people they are terminating in the area. So, they will give what is called a master data, including the attendance and the leave data, leave record data and all, and any increments, the decisions which have been taken by the management, or any bonuses that the management would want to give it to their employees. All that raw data is given by this XYZ Limited to ADP. Then ADP is going to process by considering certain whatever are required, whatever the statutory required, like even the labor laws like PF, ESI, gratuities, leave encashment. So they are expertise, they have that expertise in that. So by taking the raw data from this company, they process it, and what is the leave policy of the company, based on that how many leaves have been taken and any paid leaves or any unpaid leaves. So all that will be considered by ADP, and they will come out with what is the payroll, to the payroll amount, that is the salary amount to be paid to each employee. So this is the input. Input is given by the user entity. Now that is what we are going to call the entity which is going to take services. We call them as user entity, and the entity which is providing these kind of services we call service organization. So in short form, SO. So this is called service organization. So who would give the input data to SO? The user entity will give this. So it is like user entity will provide the input to whom? To the service organization. Then this service organization, they process it. But when they are processing, how do they process? Based on the instructions that is given by user entity to the this one. So whatever the policies or the instructions given by this user entity, they consider, they process the data according to the requirements, and this company will give the output to the user entity. Let's say if I am taking the example of payroll. Now the user entity will give the input, that is the employee database. Who are the employees? What is their attendance? What is the increment in the salaries, and how much is the PF? So all that, and any voluntary contributions towards it, complete data will be given by user entity to SO. Then SO will consider this in raw data given by them, and they will also consider the policies like leave policies, leave encashment policies and all that, and they prepare the payroll. So how much to be paid to each employee? So the net salary, and they will be giving this data to this user entity. Then the user entity will validate, let's say if it is for payroll, then the user entity is going to validate the data that is given by them, and then they will be giving this to their banker for making the payment. This is for payment. So like you can see it in the chart, user entity is the first one which will give the input to the service organization, and the service organization, by considering the policies and instructions that is given to them, they would process the data and give the output to the user entity. Then the user entity is going to perform certain final validations. They are not going to redo everything. If the user entity is going to redo everything what is being done, then there is no point in giving outsourcing. So they do their final checks, and then in the case of payroll, then the final payment list is given to the bank. Now comes the question. Say if you are the auditor of this user entity, now you are the auditor, then what happens? Now whatever the payroll that is processed, that payroll whatever is processed by the entity will appear in your P&L account as payroll transactions, the cost on employees. Now whatever the number that is appearing in XYZ Limited, now you want the sit with the XYZ Limited, how did you compute it? What are your leaves? What rate has been applied, etc. and all. What is the discounting factor? So, everything. But XYZ employees in our this one, the user entity, XYZ employee, in to give the names to it, SO organization, what we are talking about is ADP as an example. There are many such companies, ADP is just one among them. And here we talked about XYZ. So, as an auditor of XYZ, when you want to know the accuracy of the number that is presented, that is the payroll that is given over here, now you want to have a dialogue with the XYZ Limited, the HR department. But XYZ Limited, the HR department of XYZ Limited can't help you because they are not compiling any data here. So, the data is processed by the ADP. So, this XYZ Limited, simply the officials of it simply say that we do not know what the controls are, how these data numbers have been arrived at, because we have given the input data and ADP is giving the data back to it. So, as an auditor, you will not get any database clarifications from XYZ Limited for the simple reason they are not calculating it. Now, then what is the option that you are left with? Then you may have to contact ADP, you may want to visit ADP and speak to the people who are processing XYZ Limited data and want to understand how are they processing, so that you want to see whether there are any misstatements by which you may have to modify the data. In this background, you are not the auditor of ADP, you are the auditor of only user entity. So, why ADP will open up their records to the auditor? And not only that, they may or they may not, and most of the times they may not. For one simple reason, this ADP is handling this kind of payroll functions not only for XYZ Limited. XYZ Limited is only one of their clients. Like XYZ Limited, they are handling for 20,000 other clients. Now, imagine if all 20,000 other company auditors want to come and review this records of ADP, then what is the data integrity of at the ADP level, ADP office level? So, they will not be comfortable because their data is open to review by 20,000 auditors. So, 20,000 external people. Management will not be happy, nor the members will be happy. So, therefore, whenever this auditor says, I want to review the controls, now ADP will say, no, I can't allow. Now, because if I allow you, then I have to allow all other 20,000 auditors, and we do not have the bandwidth to sit with each one of them and explain. But as an auditor, you do not want to sign without getting the clarity on the numbers, and XYZ Limited is not able to tell you, and ADP is not allowing you to review it. But then how will you go for it? So, how will you certify, or how will you go for attestation? That is when you have no choice. If this is the scenario, XYZ, your client do not know the data, how it is worked out, and the third party who had processed the data is not allowing, then if this is the scenario, you would consider that as a limitation on scope, and you would directly go in for an disclaimer of opinion. So, to prevent the auditor to getting into that kind of conclusion, and to help the auditor to get this clarifications on the numbers, that is where this standard has come in. So, now what we are doing is, first I will explain the concept and then we will try to relate it. Now, when the auditor of XYZ Limited requested ADP to allow, ADP had refused. That is our earlier discussion. But ADP is giving a solution, saying, I can't allow you to touch my books because you may be auditor for XYZ, but for ADP, you are a stranger. Rather, I will appoint one auditor, let's say B, who would be reviewing the controls of ADP for all the 20,000 clients. So, that is all the controls that are existing at ADP, B will be reviewing it, and whichever the entity is asking the data, then he would be reviewing their specific contract and the specific controls requested, and he would be giving an assurance to A, saying maybe he is also a CA firm. Imagine, most likely this will be CA firms. Now, this CA firms, otherwise if it is not a CA firm, we are not talking about anything here. So, if it is a CA firm, then this B, who is reviewing the controls here, now he on behalf of A, because he is also a chartered accountant and he is also an independent person, he is reviewing at ADP and then sharing that report to. So, now B who is an independent, is giving a report to A saying that not directly to A, of course, he will give it to the correct flow, and the logical flow is this B would give it to this XYZ Limited, and this XYZ Limited will pass it on to the A. So, if you look at the whole summary, the user entity is giving the inputs, and the service organization is processing the data. But whenever you want to review the controls, let's imagine A is their auditor, and this service organization will not be allowing this A to visit it. So, if you want to allow, it will not be permitted. So, in which case, then but how the controls are to be reviewed. That is why the service organization is appointing one auditor. Now, this auditor is reviewing the controls at SO, and then whatever are his observations, he is going on giving this data to this user entity, his report, and that report, this user entity would pass on to this auditor. So, this is what is the background behind SAE 3402. So, the reports that are given by B is reviewed by A, and accordingly he is going to issue a report on this user entity. This is the whole concept. Now, who is what? A is called, first of all, we understood this XYZ Limited. What is the company? We call this as user entity, who is receiving the services, and the organization that is rendering the services. In our example, it is ADP, which is the service organization, and the reports that are issued by them is used by A. Who is A? He is the user entity auditor. That is, indirectly is the auditor of user entity, and he is called service entity auditor. So, this is the broad background behind how this flow happens as far as SAE 3402. Now, let us look directly at the meaning of it. What do you mean by service organization? Now, let us learn formally. I'll just take away these examples. Now, I'll give it with the relevant examples that we have taken. Now, what is service organization? A third party organization, in our example, it is ADP, and that provides services to user entity. So, in our example, it is XYZ Limited, and whose controls are relevant to the user's internal control over financial reporting, because their auditor is looking at it. Now, then what functions can be outsourced? He has given an example. So, he has been very clear. These are the examples. One is the payroll processing, second one is the accounting services, third one is the data processing, and fourth one is bank transactions processor, and the fifth example is outsourced IT service provided. But these are illustrative, not exhaustive. So, this is only for your understanding. So, this is about service organization. Then who is user entity? User entity is an entity that uses the services. That is all. That is why the nomenclature matches. User auditor, the auditor of the user entity. In our example, A is that, and who was the user entity for us? In our example, XYZ Limited. And who is the service auditor? Independent professional accountant who is engaged to report controls on it. So, in our example, it is B. So, these are the definitions that are talked about in SAE 3402. So, with this, the definitions are over. Then comes the question, why are the service organization controls are important? Why these are important? Because without understanding these controls, the user entity's auditor may not be able to give a clean opinion. So, may not be able to give an unmodified opinion, because the user entity is not aware of the controls, and the entire data is processed at the service organization. So, if this report is not provided, then user entity auditor may not be able to conclude on the effectiveness of it. That is why the standard is required at this place. Then, what is the scope of the standard? Now, what is the scope of? So, the scope of this is when the service organization, that is when the standard would become applicable. So, this standard would become applicable when the service organization is responsible for controls and they want to provide an assertion To whom? To the user entity. So, about those controls. That is when the standard would arise. Now, where this standard does not apply? This standard does not apply where if it is only merely reporting, that is without providing any assurance, merely providing a report whether controls are operated, that is their internal communication, then this 3402 doesn't arise. Or if that is relating to any controls related to other than financial reporting, that is why we are saying unrelated to financial reporting, like production controls, because not only finance functions are outsourced. In fact, bigger companies, they would be outsourcing many other functions, like say their painting or their accessories and the packing material. So in that background, what you have outsourced and the controls relating to it is nothing to do with the financial reporting, then the standard has no application. So to cut short, this standard would become applicable only when the service organization is responsible for the controls and they are providing assertion about that controls to the user entity and the user entity auditor. That is when we will apply this. What is the objective of service auditor? So, the service auditor is, you are aware, so the auditor of the service organization who is reviewing the work only to give assurance of the controls to the user entity. Now, the service auditor aims to obtain reasonable assurance on these things. First one, description of the system, that is how the system is designed and how is it implemented. And then design of controls apart from the system, if that is the system they want to operate, then what are the controls that are suitably designed to see that there are no misstatements or there are no gaps in the processing. And then you maybe you would have designed the system, you have designed the controls, but are they operating effectively? That is, are the people following it, or are there any technical or human related issues? So this is what are the 3 points that an auditor would try to look at it. Now we come to the major part of the discussion. See, in this standard, there are 2 reports, type 1 report and type 2 report. So, in the type 1 report and type 2 report, like I will take you here and then we will go to the summary. Say, in the type 1 report, but first of all, who is issuing this type 1 report or type 2 report to whom? The service auditor is issuing it to user entity and the user entity will be passing it on to the auditor of user entity. So, or user entity auditor. So, this is the flow of it, both type 1 or type 2. Now, what is type 1? Type 1 talks about description of services, that is what are the systems they are having it, and the management assertion that with these systems, whatever the systems that they have embedded, they are fairly described and the controls are suitably designed over there. And on these, the service auditor, because this is the management assertion, on top of it, the service auditor will provide assurance whether he agree with the management on the effectiveness of controls or not. So, in these 2 points that you see, one is the description of the system and the second one is the controls, designing of controls. If these 2 are the ones which are given, then that is called type 1 report. Then what is type 2 report? So, type 2 report, it includes everything in type 1 report plus the operating effectiveness. This word, take 3 stars to it. That is, in this type 1 report, auditor is not commenting on the operating effect. Auditor is only talking about is there a system and are there controls established, but whether that established controls are operating effectively, that is not being talked about. But if you want that also to be confirmed by the service auditor, then we call it as a type 2 report. So, and he will also give what are the controls that he has tested and what is the results of this test that has been performed of it. Now, look at the difference between type 1 and type 2. Mark it. This is important from your exam perspective. He is asking what are the types of reports and what is type 1 report and what is type 2 report. So, let us touch one more time. So, type 1 report basically talks about the description of the service that has been outsourced and what is the management assertion that the system is fairly described and the controls, whatever they have established, they are suitably designed. So, it only talks about whether the controls they have designed are suitable to the task. Now, you have designed the controls, but are they operating effectively? So, that is also to be seen. Like say, you have installed CCTVs, but are the CCTVs functioning? And is the angle of the camera being proper captured? And what about the backup data of it? I am just giving an example of say ATM operations. So, that way you had the controls, but many times that we see wherever there is a fraud happening. Now, there is a CCTV and there is an I mean the other physical controls, there is a security guard and all, but what is this robbers are doing? They are attacking the security guard, so physical control has gone and the CCTV is damaged. So, you have, that's why whenever these big robberies are happening, the police may not be able to recover any data, because either the camera is not working, or the angle of the camera is changed, or the camera is destroyed. So, that is where the type 1 report may not give that much of comfort to the user entity auditor, because this only talks about what is the service and what are the controls that are designed for it. Now, you have designed the controls, but are they working effectively? Are they operating effectively? That will be missing in this type 1 report. So, if that's the major point in the type 2 report. So, in the type 2 report, you have everything of type 1 plus you have operating effectiveness of this controls, plus the auditor, service auditor, to ensure that whatever the controls are working proper, he would have test checked the controls. So, whatever the controls he has test checked, now he would be giving the results also to the user entity auditor. So, as a user entity auditor, now I am convinced with the type 2 report. I am able to understand what is the system, what are the controls, and whether that controls are working effectively. But to substantiate this, whether these controls are working effectively, the service auditor is going to provide what are the controls that he has tested and what is the outcome of it. So, therefore, now you tell me, if you are the user entity auditor, which one will give you more comfort? It is the type 2 report. But obviously, then every company would ask for type 2 report, but it is the money that is involved in it. If you want only type 1 report, that is, he will only study the system and he will see whether the controls are established, he will charge X amount. But if the user entity auditor insists that I want type 2 report, then the service auditor will have to perform this test controls and then derive the outcomes and then analyze the outcomes, and then accordingly he will be commenting on this operating effectiveness. So, that would cost X plus some amount. So, then do we spend that amount and get type 2 report, or is type 1 is sufficient enough? That would depend on the volumes that are being outsourced and the output of the service organization, how important it is, the activity that you have outsourced, how important it is for the user organization's financial statements. If it is a very important item, then as an user entity auditor, I would insist for type 2 report. But what the services that I am taking are important, but not that material to the user entity, then I do not want the entity to waste so much of money, because that is not very material to my financial statement which I am certifying. So, I would be happy with the type 1 report. So, these are the differences between type 1 report and type 2 report. So, type 2 report, it will contain everything in type 1, plus the auditor would be testing the controls, and with that testing he would come to the outcomes, and by analyzing the outcomes, auditor. So, logically the flow is, first he will test the controls and he will analyze the outcomes, and then he will give you this operating effectiveness of the control. So, this is what are the differences between type 1 report and the type 2 report. In a shorter form, you can see here. Type 1. This is being tested for you. I am repeating in multiple ways so that you can answer all the MCQ questions and all the case scenarios that are asked on this. So, type 1 describes the system and the design of the controls over there, whereas the type 2 report, it will include not only type 1, but the additional point, test of controls and the results, which will give you the operating effectiveness of it. So, that is what is type 2. So, Which one gives more assurance? That is what you are saying. So type 2 provides more assurance. So as it shows, not only the design of the controls, see here, not only the design of the controls, but how they have worked in practice. So therefore, type 2 is what generally be insisted if the item that is being outsourced is very material to the financial statements. See, look at the question from your study material. Now, this Bansi Group is a leading institution running prestigious postgraduate courses in the field of management. Its financial statements are audited by an independent auditor, and before the start of this academic session, the board of the institution had outsourced, mind you here. So, they had outsourced its entire process of inviting student applications, submission of applications, and the collection of application fees, including the late fees and all that matters to another company which is called Easy Solutions. Your client is Bansi Group and it has been outsourced to this one. Now, the auditors of Bansi Group. So, what do we call? User entity auditors. So, in this case, first to connect with you conceptually, this is user entity and this is the service organization. So, now the auditors of Bansi Group wants to be more sure about the design. Look at here, the design and operating effectiveness of controls. So, when that auditors are looking for not only the design of controls, but also the operating effectiveness of controls, then he is asking then what type of report would be required over here. So, now when you are looking at operating effectiveness of these controls, type 1 would not be sufficient and you would require type 2 report. So, as an answer to this, you are supposed to describe what are the two types of reports and elaborate a bit more on this type 2 report. So, this is the discussion on this type of reports that are being issued by the service organization's auditor or the service audit. So, after getting an understanding of what is user entity, what is service organization, who is user entity auditor and who is service entity auditor, now let's move on with the further one. How this engagement is conducted, that is the service auditor. Now we will get various doubts whether, see, as an auditor of user entity, when you say auditor, you are referring to the statutory auditor. So, he is independent, but our basic doubt is the service auditor, that is the auditor reviewing the controls at the service organization, in our example the ADP. Now, is he also supposed to be independent? So, that is what the standard would try to sort with. Like say another example, management representations. Now, management representations are mandatory for the statutory auditor, but the service auditor is not a statutory auditor because he is not certifying the financials, he is only reviewing the controls. So, in that background, will he also have to take this management representations? So, these are the concepts that are being talked about in this next paragraph. So, look at here. So, this entire thing is about service auditor, don't get confused. That is the service organization's auditor. So, now he should ensure that compliance of ethical requirements and independence. Take 1 star to it, it can be an MCQ. So, your user entity auditor is independent because that is anyway he is a statutory auditor, he should be independent. But not only user entity auditor, even the service auditor also should be independent. Then only the user entity auditor can rely. Then he must that integrity, the second objective, and the third one is the objectivity. So, integrity is the truthfulness and the honesty, and objectivity is unbiased. So, these are the ethical requirements which are to be complied by the service auditor. Then, as I told you, the regular statutory auditor will obtain this MRLs, but is he also supposed to obtain MRLs? The answer is yes. So, here take 1 star to it. So, the service auditor is expected to obtain representations, explanations and informations from whom? From the management or from those charged with the governance. But from whom he will take it, that we have already discussed in the earlier chapter, which is on SA 580, that is whoever is responsible or whoever is having the knowledge of it. So, from them he will obtain. But one technical question, when you say management, which management? Now, is it service organizations management or the user entity management? Both the ones we are talking of service organization. So, because he is an auditor doing the review of controls at the service organization. So, he would be getting all this from the service organization. Now, the third one, acceptance of engagement. So, because he is a professional and that too he is supposed to be independent and maintain integrity and objectivity. So, before accepting, the auditor should ensure that the necessary competence exists, because these areas are the ones which are not like a routine audit of financial statement. It is neither an audit nor a review. So, therefore, the auditor, the service auditor, first he will have to review whether he is having the competence to accept it. Second one, whether there is a suitable criteria is available for verification. And the third one, whether the terms that you have set for engagement are agreed. So, or the management has any reservations. Once these three are satisfied, the auditor would agree to it. Then what are the objectives of service auditor? What are the objectives of service auditor? To fair description of the system, and he has to comment on suitability of the design of controls, and he will also talk about operating effectiveness. Now you know that these two would come in type 1, and operating effectiveness will not be there. But in type 2, all three will be there. So, depending on what is expected of the service organization auditor, he would choose his objective. If what is expected is only type 1 report, then the third point is not an objective of the service auditor. So, he will make the amends of it. Then procedures. So, what are the procedures that are to be performed? So, by the service auditor, what he will do over there? So, that is, as an user entity auditor, normally we verify the balance sheet, we verify the financial statement, balance sheet, P&L, notes to accounts to satisfy other assertions. But is the service auditor, the background I am telling, what is the service auditor verifying? The service auditor is not verifying financial statements, mind you. So, this point is about the service organization auditor, or I would say the auditor of service organization. What are the procedures? Where is he performing? He is performing at the SO. Then is he verifying? So, at the SO, is he verifying the financial statements of SO? The answer is no. That is not his job. He is not been appointed to review the financial statements of service organization. Then what is he trying to do? He is trying to see the controls or IC, you can simply call it as. So, this controls, effectiveness of these controls is the objective, and so whatever is the objective of this, to meet that objective would be performing procedures. So, what he will perform, and here you shouldn't write verification of opening balance, all this kind of stuff, because he is not verifying the financial statements. So, he is only reviewing the control. So, what steps would he perform? First one, it's an essay question, and probably you can consider this for, let us say, from exam perspective, short answer question. So, you can expect either 4 marks or 5 marks of it. What is it going to do? Assess suitable criteria. So, that is, the criteria is suitable for the output, whatever they are expecting. So, have been used for preparing the description of the system and the control designing and the operating effectiveness. This operating effectiveness would come only in type 2 report. So, this point, wherever it appears, you take 1 star to it, and you have been questioned multiple MCQs and multiple case studies, including 5 marks questions based on this one's common understanding of this point. So, first he will assess the suitability of the criteria, and then he will determine the materiality, because like any other auditor, he also will have, while forming opinion, he also will consider the materiality while describing the same points. Designing the system, designing the control, and operating effectiveness, same points. So, he will consider the materiality. And then third step, what he would do. So, while reviewing it, again keep reminding yourself, you are talking about auditor of service organization, and his task is not to review of the service organization. So, in our example, the B is not reviewing the financial statements of this ADP. So, he is only reviewing at the operating controls. So, obtain understanding of the service organization system. So, he must obtain the controls, service organizations controls. Now, what he will try to understand? Nature of the services, that is what type of services are being provided, and what are the processes they are following, and what are the controls they have established, and what is the objective of each of these controls, because if there is a mismatch between the control you are having and the objective of the control, then it will become a failure. So, therefore, it is required. And what is the environment, control environment, how is it being monitored, is it effective? So, these are the points on which the SO auditor, again I am reviewing, the SO auditor is trying to understand. And after understanding, then he would start gathering audit evidence regarding the description of the system. So, for that, what he will do? He will read the system description and he will evaluate whether it is fairly presented for an understanding of a third person. So, and then obtain evidence regarding the design of the control. So, the same points like whatever you have seen here, system description was the first point, and design of the controls and operating effectiveness of the controls. Here also the same thing. So, this audit evidence was about the description of the system. Now, it is about the design of controls, whether the controls are properly designed and they are capable of achieving, whether they have actually achieved or not will come in operating effectiveness. But here, whether they are capable of achieving the stated control objectives, that is what will be reviewed by it. And the third one, after understanding the description of the system and design of controls, now the auditor would obtain audit evidence regarding operating effectiveness. But this is required only in type 2, whereas these two are required in type 1 and all this 4, 5, 6 are required in type 2. Same point, system description, design of controls and operating effectiveness. Then consider while doing it, there was a doubt. See, this SO auditor is reviewing the control at the service organization. But what if the service organization is already having an internal auditor? Can he rely on them? So, obviously, he can rely. So, if there is already an internal function exists, then the service auditor can rely, but before placing reliance, he must understand and evaluate what is the nature of that internal audit activities and what is the relevance of the work that is performed and whether you can take the help of it. If the internal auditor also had almost analyzed the same content, then obviously he can utilize it. But if the internal auditor has done something different other than what is being done, then he may not be able to use it. So, whether to use the internal audit function or not, the service auditor would have to evaluate what are the nature of services or the nature of controls that are being reviewed by them and what is the work reviewed by them. If he is convinced, then he can take the help of this internal auditor by reading his reports. So, next move on to the written representation. Not to worry, first I am trying to take you through all this, and at the end I will logically connect you one more time through the super summary. Now, so written representations. Now, who is obtaining from whom? The service organization's auditor. So, SOA I am calling it. Service organization auditor is obtaining it from the management or those charged with the governance of whom? Which management? Of the service organization's management. So, that is what it is. And what is this representation letter should contain? So, this should contain the following. The management has provided assertion accompanying the system description, and the second one, all relevant information and access has been provided to the service auditor, because if the access is not given and the complete information is not given, then that would become a limitation, and with that limitation service auditor may have to go for a disclaimer. If service auditor is giving a disclaimer, then user entity auditor cannot make use of his report at all. So, therefore, service organization auditor had to be given full access to it. And then disclosure of matters. So, whether any non-compliance of laws and regulations or any frauds or uncorrected deviations and or design deficiencies in case there are anything, or the controls which did not operate as described, but this will come in type 2 report, and the events occurring after the reporting period and which may affect. So, it is indirectly the subsequent events, that is what has been analyzed at the down level. So, on all these points, who is obtaining this representation from whom? The auditor of service organization is obtaining from the management of those charged with the governance of the service entity. So, and basis which he would be performing and issuing this report. Then what are subsequent events? Say normally the subsequent events are the events occurring after the, to put it in a student language, the date of financial statements, I would call the, say, the date of financial statements and the date of audit report. So, date of financial statements and the date of audit report. All the transactions that are happening in between are what are called the subsequent events. But here, why I have drafted this is, this we have already discussed at another video. So, under chapter 5 we have already covered them, sorry, chapter 6 we have already covered. But the intention of this here is, as a service or auditor of service organization, I am not certifying the financial statements. So, what are my subsequent events here? I can't repeat the, mind you here, I can't repeat this definition. Suppose if we were to ask you one conceptual question, what are the subsequent events that are to be reviewed by the service organization auditor? And if you keep writing this, the subsequent events are the events occurring after the date of balance sheet or the date of financial statements, you are wrong, because this is not what is reviewed by service organizations auditor. Then what is this? So, that is after the period covered by the auditor or covered by the report. So, the period till when you are reporting and the date of assurance report. So, any difference between this A and B, because you do not have financial statements, then what is the cutoff point here? The point up till which you are asked to control the reviews, you are asked to issue the report on the controls. So, that period and the actual date of audit report, the difference between them is what is? So, it is like report date. That is, I mean, when we talk about here the subsequent events, what are the subsequent events? The cutoff date is the last day of the reporting period, sorry. Last date of the reporting period, that is the period for which you are talking about the controls vis-a-vis your date of assurance report. Whenever you are giving the report under SAE this 3402, so any transactions in between are called subsequent events, and the auditor would verify them to see whether it is having any impact on the report. So, with this, the procedures which are performed by the service organization auditor is complete. Now, we come to his report. Now, who is report it is? We are talking about the report by the auditor's assurance report given by the service auditor. So, who is giving this report to whom? The service organization's auditor or the service auditor, you can simply call it. He is giving it to the user entity, and the user entity will give it to the user entity auditor. So, in between, you can say he is, this service organization auditor is giving it to service organization, or the service and the service organization may be issuing to user entity. The engagements can happen both ways. Say, why I have drafted this is to give you conceptual understanding. Situation 1, because the user entity auditor, listen here, because the user entity auditor wants this effectiveness of the controls, he would insist this user entity to get this report. Then the user entity, by speaking to the service organization, they will appoint directly this auditor at a service organization, in which case he would be reporting directly to user entity. The second scenario, whenever the user entity auditor is, this is scenario 2, is asking user entity, then the user entity is requesting this service organization to get this done, then the service organization will appoint an auditor, and that is how this will be, the flow will be reversed to him. So, whichever. So, he can be appointed by the service organization, or he may be appointed by the user entity. So, that is what is the one. Anyway, that does not matter, he is not testing so much on it. What are the contents of the report? So, just mark that as a B category. As of now, he is not asking too many questions, very old questions he used to ask. So, what are the basic elements? First one, title. Second one, addressee. Addressee here is the appointing authority, and the identification. Identification of what? System description, management assertion, and type 1 or type 2 report. Now, then what is the additional identifications? Wherever relevant, the auditor, service entity auditor would be talking on the complementary user entity controls. Take 1 star to it. This you will discuss it in SA 402. So, in detail. What are complementary user entity controls? These controls are set at the user entity to validate the information given by the service organization. Now, let us look at what are this complementary user entity controls. Now, look at the flow. Or if you believe you get confused by seeing all this, look at the direct example of it. This is more easy for you to, rather than getting into one more theory. So, what will happen here? This ABC Limited, the user entity, had outsourced this to the XYZ payroll services. So, this is the service organization, this is the SO, and this is the user entity. Now, who would give this input to whom? User entity will give input to the SO, and what the SO will give it to the user entity is the output. This is our understanding. Now, whenever the service organization is giving payroll data to user entity, then the the data, whatever is given by it, that is validated. Like these are all complementary user entity controls. That is, they are validating employee master database with what he has been given, and they are reviewing the payroll reports whatever have been given here, and the exception list. So, that is any abnormal variance between the current month salary and the earlier month salary for one particular employee. Likewise, and what is the total amount of payroll for this period, and what is the total amount of payroll for the earlier period. So, likewise, and authorize the payroll run. So, that is whatever the output that is given by XYZ payroll, the payment will not be made. The user entity told the banker that don't go by XYZ Limited, that XYZ Limited will give the report to me and I will validate it, and only after validation this payments had to be made. So, they are authorizing. So, till the time they authorize, payments are not made. So, the controls that are performed by the user entity to ensure the correctness of the output that is given by service organization, that is what we call it as a complementary user entity controls. Now, why is it relevant? If the user entity is blindly, say, I will write one more time, user organization, that is the user entity, sorry, let me use the same word through the standard. User entity is giving inputs to service organization, and the service organization process the data based on the suitable criteria, and then they forward this output to the user entity, and then the user entity may blindly, let's say it is the payroll, then employee database, you are giving it to them, they consider all the taxation, TDS, 192, whatever it is, whatever the taxation, and they are giving the payroll data. Suppose, imagine, whatever the payroll data that is recommended by service organization, if the user entity is simply going to ask the banker, now you process the payroll, that is, they are not checking anything, then the controls are weak. Then what if there is an error in the output? So, to prevent it, the user organization, before giving this to the banker, they want to check, they want to reconcile. So, any these are called complementary user entity controls. So that are performed by the user entity at the user entity to validate the data. This is the background of it. Anyway, we will discuss this in detail under other standard. Then subservice organization. What do you mean by subservice? Putting it in a diagram one, user entity had outsourced to service organization and service organization had outsourced to another service organization. That is what we call it as an subservice organization. And then the criteria used and then control objectives. So these are the additional identifications that should be taken in the report. Then management responsibility. So what is the management responsible? Everything. Preparing the system, preparing the controls and stating this control objectives and design and implementing this control. So for all this, management is responsible. Now, what is service auditor is responsible? Service auditor is responsible for issuing type 1 or type 2 report. So, since it is neither an audit nor an review, he must make sure that the language that he is giving is depicting it. So, the service auditor should state that to express an opinion on the service organization's description of its system. So, he is not commenting on the financials, organization's description of the system and the suitability of the controls. For this, if you are also expecting operating effectiveness, because till here again we repeat, till here it is type 1 plus operating effectiveness, if we are adding it, it will become type 2. That's all. So, and then statement of compliance. So, the auditor, a statement should be given that they have complied with SAE 3402. So, whatever the ICI is suggesting, they must confirm that they are complying with that. And description of procedures. So, whatever the procedures they have performed, they must describe it. And what are the procedures they would have performed? That again would depend on type 1 and type 2. If it is type 1, 2 points, description of system and design of controls. In type 3, operating effectiveness. So, but how the auditor is confirming the operating effectiveness? Because he is testing them. So, that is and based on the output is coming to that conclusion. So, that will be described over there. And then limitation on scope. So, any inherent limitations, so where the auditor, the report must mention, because these are the controls may fail because it is not a robo where to operate, and there can be a human error in the data, or there may be changes in the conditions, or the feature effectiveness cannot be guaranteed. That is, though the controls are good, but you don't want to give any feature guarantee to it. So, it simple disclaimer type of it, a limitation on controls would be given over there. Then comes the service auditor's opinion. So, this is take 3 stars. This is the crux of this point. That would depend again on type 1 report and type 2 report. Now, type 1 report, what will be there? Description of the system, and second one is controls, designing of the controls. Controls are designed properly. Those are the ones. And once it is type 2, then operated effectively throughout the period. So, this third point also would come into the picture. So, but whatever it is, just to technically, though he is not highlighted here, what the auditor will be giving here is a negative assurance. Take this word, negative assurance. That is, it is the language in which you mention to it. So, under this, like say for example, direct assurances, like say the regular statutory auditor, he say that yes, the financials represent true and fair view. It's a direct one. But here the auditor would say that nothing has come to my knowledge to say that the controls are ineffective. So, since he is going to say that nothing has come, he is telling the same thing, controls are effective. But instead of confirming controls are effective, this service auditor would be confirming that the negative, that is nothing has come to his knowledge to say that the controls are not effective. So, that is why we call this as a negative assurance, mark that word. And after that, like any other report, date, signature, place, those details would be there. And apart from these key elements, if I go back, first was the title, Second is the addressee, basically the appointing authority. And third one, identification of system description, management assertion, and type 1, type 2. And any additional point depending on the existence of complementary user entity controls and all. And then manager responsibilities. Two responsibilities, management responsibilities and service auditors responsibilities. And then finally statement of compliance and the description of the procedures and limitation on scope and the opinion. So, this opinion is what we call as negative service, negative assurance, that is what will be given over there, and date, place and signature. Then if it is a type 2 report, apart from the above one, additional points would come in, that is description of test, because here he has only described the system, but under type 2 he has to talk about the effectiveness of it. Auditor would talk about what are the tests he has performed and what is the nature of testing, what is the sample size, what is the testing method. You can see here he will give all this, and if any deviations are there, then extent of testing should be disclosed. So, how much you have tested and for what is the amount, and the nature of deviation, what type of deviations if you have noticed, and deviations must be reported even if the overall control objective were achieved. That is, even if the controls are performing for whatever it is, but any deviations auditor should confirm to it. So, and finally modified opinion. When an auditor would issue modified opinion? So, auditor would issue modified opinion when the system description is not fairly presented, because the way the system is performing is not presented properly, or controls are not suitably designed. So, they are not designed. So, controls are not designed, or even if they are designed, they did not operate effectively. But since this operational effectiveness will be talked in type 2, this would become only important and relevant in type 2. And then any limitation, this is a routine one, because in this case, since the service auditor is not a statutory auditor, there could be certain limitations imposed by the management. So, then what are that limitations? He would give a details of it. So, with this, the discussion on this SAE 3402 would come to an end, and the last piece in that is the documentation. So, what is that? The auditor should document. So, whom are we talking about? We are talking about only service auditor. We are not talking about user entity auditor. Mind you, in the entire standard, whether it talks about procedures to be performed, a report to be issued, objectives, we are talking about only service auditor. Why? Why not user entity auditor? If it is about user entity auditor, since he is a statutory auditor, SA would become applicable, not SAE. So, because it is SAE, we are not talking anything on the statutory auditor. So, therefore, all the points, what are the procedures, what is the objective, what is the contents of the report, and documentation, everything we are talking about from the service auditor's perspective. But easy and independent, yes, he also must perform and satisfy the ethical requirements of it. Now, come back. What is that he should document in his working papers, as a part of documentation? NTE, nature, timing and extent of procedures performed. What is the evidence that he had obtained? And what are the results and the conclusions that he has reached based on that results? And what are the significant professional judgments? Anything if they are made, then he would keep it as a documentation. So, with this, we conclude our discussion on SAE 3402. Now, I will quickly wrap up for the 5 minutes wrap up, so that you can consolidate your understanding. In this standard, point 1, to reassure, we are not talking on the statutory auditor of user entity. So, if it is about statutory auditor of user entity, we would have complied with SA and not SAE. So, under this, who is the auditor whenever we are talking about auditor? Who is the auditor we are talking about? We are talking about the auditor at the service organization. Now, at the broader level, a super level summary. In this, there are two entities, service organization and user entity. Now, who is providing service is the service organization. Who is receiving the service is the user entity. Now, this auditors, whatever we are talking about, for whom he is doing this review of the controls. He is doing this review of the controls only of the service organization. And what are the two types of reports here? So, type 1 and type 2, which gives more assurance? Type 2. Why? Because apart from designing the controls, which is included in type 1, the auditor here is also performing the test checks and he is giving the results, and with that results, what is his opinion? That is the operating effectiveness. So, since he is talking about this, the type 2 report would become more satisfactory for the auditor to continue. Then, what are the procedures that are to be performed and what are the objectives of the auditor? So, all that points would follow. And then what is the reporting structure? In the reporting structure, basically it is all the same, and because it is neither an audit nor a review, he should refrain himself from using it as an audit opinion. And the bigger point in this is this type of assurance. So, the type of assurance given by this service auditor is called negative assurance. It is because of the language, not that he is saying that controls are not good, it is the language how he is expressing. So, his report, he will not say that yes, the controls are effective, but what the ICI says is, put the same point, controls are effective. Instead of calling it as controls are effective, put that slightly different. Nothing has come to my knowledge to say that controls are ineffective. So, little indirect speech type. So, that is why it is called negative assurance. This word is important, and you may be tested in the examination about what is the type of assurance that an auditor should comply with. So, with this, we complete our discussion on SAE 3402, and whenever we meet after the break, then we will get into this next standard, which is SAE 3402. So, till then, take a break, and let's meet again after the break for continuing our discussion on the next standard. Thank you.